Genesis, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, right now on States and Kingdoms. Welcome back to States and Kingdoms. Today we're talking about Genesis' album, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway from 1974. Now this is one of my favorites.
Well, this is going to be a two-parter.
Right. I forgot. Part 1.
Right.
It's too much to talk about all in one go.
Well, we won't be able to do it. Yeah, so this is actually, a really important record for you. Mm-hmm. This is, of course, for me as well, the first Genesis record I heard, other than the fact that we grew up with We Can't Dance on the radio.
Yeah.
The songs from that. Mm-hmm. But this was really the first Genesis that I heard, and it was really just because of you.
Yeah, and the impulse to buy this in the first place was really Jeff Buckley's album, mm-hmm. Sketches for My Sweetheart the Drunk, and there's a very lo-fi version of Back in New York City mm-hmm. on that album, and I knew it was Genesis, and I felt compelled to get this and start listening to them, and so I got this album on CD, of course. And I loved it. I loved it right away.
You hear a cover song, and then you mm-hmm. go back and listen, to whoever that was and their influences and all that,
Yeah.
So it is interesting at that age. I mean, you traced this back to Genesis. So this, so what's funny about this album is strangely not as talked about. The height of Peter Gabriel's tenure with Genesis, certainly the end of it.
People talk about the bookends, the albums around this album.
Yeah, they do.
A lot.
But they do. They Selling Them by the Pound, which I can never say properly.
And A Trick of the Tail.
And Trick of the Tail are really talked about more. Mm-hmm. And this album is just in between,
Being like, love me.
And I've seen people say that it's not a good introduction, and yet it was for you.
Yeah, I mean, of course, like you said, we were familiar with Genesis.
Not really,
Dad listened to them.
Just a little.
I knew that Dad had listened to their 70s albums, but, he wasn't actively listening to any Genesis when we were of, formative age.
No memory of it.
And, so I went and got this, and, it was a fine introduction, because after this, I got Wind and Wuthering, and I went down mm-hmm. the whole line and revisiting the early 80s albums that I'd, memories of, and just so has all the sounds, all the things that you can go in either direction and get more of.
I think it's, it may not be the one that I would actually give to someone first.
Well, it's a lot.
But I'm not sure why it wouldn't be. I think it's a very easy album to get into. Yeah,
it's completely accessible, and I had immediate reactions to it when I first listened to it.
There's something very intriguing about the story, that it's a rock opera, so-called. Mm-hmm. The setting for the story is very unique and strange, and it's about, half Puerto Rican, and we almost make it.
Right. New York City. Graffiti artist.
Yeah, it's altogether interesting and intriguing as it is. Mm-hmm. And then when you play it, I think it's hard not to be won over by the music. And the side that we're talking about, which is part 1.
Right. A and B.
Side 1 and 2.
Mm-hmm. You can say it that way if you want.
Sure. Has just a lot of very exciting, pretty aggressive, mm-hmm. Great music. And I think it's a little bit grittier than
the second album, or
than much of anything they ever did. There's it is.
Well, he really he turned on that New York, that city feeling.
Yeah.
It's like angsty and
that's
American.
I was going to say that, yeah.
Which is very different from Selling England by the Pound.
And that's one thing I was going to say. Right. One is how different from Selling England by the Pound it is, because mm-hmm. it's not English very much at all, which makes sense.
Right.
And or not at all.
Right.
But it's not Selling America by the Dollar either. And the angst of it, actually, I think at least for teenagers, which is what we were, makes it very easy to grab hold of. Mm-hmm. And there is a lot of that.
Yeah.
And, that's not typical for Genesis. It's not. And it also makes it more, I still think, like I said before, I still think this that this album seems more modern, modern. This album seemed more contemporary.
Right. Yeah.
And still kind of does.
It does.
Listen to it.
It does. I mean, we talk about this all the time, and I think when we do our final like Genesis full ranking video, this will come up a lot, but the sequence of Genesis albums, I always want to put the albums in different order. Like going by the years, the dates doesn't make sense to me. Like this album, it doesn't make sense that this comes in between Selling England by the Pound and Trick of the Tail. I want this to be like after And Then There Were Three and right before Duke.
Because there are some qualities that it has that really do fit into that time period.
And in a lot of ways, you know, I don't think it's because I listened to this first, but I always thought of this album differently. I feel like it is very different from the rest of their albums. And I don't think it's just because it's a double album. There's something about this record that sits outside of the rest of the Genesis catalog for me. But this one is just, I don't know, it's just special.
The song I remember most coming from your bedroom loudly was just the first song, actually.
Really?
Yeah. When I was out on Broadway.
And then you like tuned it out.
It's such a great song. You know, it's such a great song. And I did a little bit. I mean, you know, this is an album that I did not follow you into this.
No, you didn't.
Like I did with Steely Dan, the Beach Boys, Queens of the Stone Age, or I don't know, a couple of things. I mean, you know, you didn't follow me into anything. You weren't like listening to Sepultura at all. It
took me a little while, but I followed you into Deftones. Yeah. Ween, anyway. Deftones.
Oh, I was saying it's such a good song, such a good opening. It's not an overture.
It has that sense.
It does feel, it is of course an intro, a very cinematic intro. Mm-hmm. You know, it's really good. It sets the stage. Also, and now I said cinematic, I said stage.
Yeah, it's also theatrical.
It's also theatrical, yeah. So you know, it
turns the page. It's also literary.
And then goes into Fly on the Windshield. Which
is such a powerhouse song.
Well, it is, but the way it opens is actually very Genesis-y. Mm-hmm. You know, it does. It's not that dissimilar from
it's very atmospheric.
And then
all of a sudden it just like...
explodes.
Yeah.
And what's so cool about that moment is it's all of them. The guitar right at the front, too, which is not always the case. You know, Final Windshield then seamlessly goes into Broadway Melody of 1974, in which he makes every American reference possible in a short amount of time.
He really does.
It's a great song too, though. I mean, the bass on and you know the classic Genesis, you know, stuff.
Yeah, the song it kind of just like it spreads out and like spacey.
Peter sounds amazing on this album. That's another thing. I mean, like, you know, his singing is always great, but his singing is so expressive and it's very different.
It is.
You know, I mean, obviously he is trying to do, you know, a more American, sounds like more contemporary, you know, American kind of...
his style is very different on this
melodies
record.
And everything that he's doing. It's really very interesting. So, you know, I have read the story, which, you know, so it puts me a little bit above Phil, at least.
You read the story.
And, you know, talking about the story and how it relates to the songs, and that's a kind of bit of exegetical stuff that we don't really do, at least not now.
Exegenesical.
Yeah. But I'll just say the story, I like every bit of this. I don't consider this, like, is the story a success? Does this work? Is it, you know, I think it's so ambitious. And there aren't that many people that could have done this or would have tried to do it. The story itself is rather surreal in that it does juxtapose, you know, dreaminess with reality and, you know, unlike things. And I consider it done well. Mm-hmm. You know, there are flaws in it.
But like you said,
it's one of those things that just to do it to me, makes it a success.
Yeah, it is so ambitious. And I would say successful. I think it's always fascinated me. The whole idea, the whole concept, I just find fascinating. He really weaved this really intense, like, dreamscape, cityscape. It's like all wrapped up, and it's fantastical, and it's surreal and ambiguous. And I think it's just, even if you don't know what the hell he's talking about,
which is fine,
it's still so just
Evocative
of so much imagery,
yeah.
so much imagery, and I always thought it was just fascinating.
Genesis is one of the more literate bands, and I always like the way they approach that. There is in anything that they do, a bit of sardonic or farcical humor, just a little bit, that always keeps it from being maybe as ponderous as it could. And even in this, I still think that's so.
Like Steely Dan.
Well, I mean, but it's there's a lot that we could talk about more really with that, and I mean, at least I think we could. Cuckoo Cocoon.
It's so pretty.
Well, it is nice, and what's happening in the story is not so nice. It's kind of interesting, but then leads to In the Cage, and In the Cage is I mean, is it the longest track on this?
It might be.
The first part, I think so. Well, it's a remarkable song, but also again, it's fast. Mm-hmm. There is a kind of stripped down quality to this album, even the longer songs.
No, there is, and it's like this constant like propelling forward.
And his singing as well, but the bass and the drums just driving the whole thing forward.
I feel with this song, it's like this like cyclical thing, and I feel like he's trapped.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
So successful.
Good job, Pete.
So after that song, which is very dramatic and full of angst and anguish,
then Peter starts singing over Tony Banks' instrumentals, pissing him off.
The Grand Parade of Lifeless Packaging, which I mean, it sounds kind of American, but you have to rub it in.
We like parades. In my mind, this song doesn't have like a typical structure. It kind of feels like it has a procession, like a parade. Like it starts off kind of quietly and builds and builds and builds until it's kind of just, it passes you by. So side 2 starts with Back in New York City, which is such a powerful song.
It's a good beginning for a side.
Yeah, and like Peter's vocal is so forceful and aggressive.
After Selling England by the Pound, this album is just not what you'd be expecting. So in a way, you should always kind of see that coming with Genesis. Would be an awesome song to play if you could do it. And
it is not an easy song to sing.
Yeah,
I mean, this is some performance. I mean, even if he wasn't like belting out the way he does, I mean, the range and everything about this song, it's intense.
Yeah, Jeff Buckley, he goes on the more melodic part. He's singing it very very much.
Very soft.
Yeah, it's very softly.
Very soft.
And a little bit of a higher pitch.
Yeah.
But no, it's a great song. I mean, the whole the riff, everything about it. It's bass, exciting.
Like that bass line that just comes at. It's not even a line. It's just like a punctuation.
Yeah, it's one of the most exciting tracks that they ever did. This part of the story is a little strange, and Hairless Heart is actually a lovely little instrumental. I don't know if they meant that like contrapuntally, along with how weird the story is getting, and this is just such a nice instrument. And so this leads into Counting Out Time, and this is interesting. The 2 singles that they released are both back to back on the first.
I'll forever think those are weird choices.
Well, it's kind of Counting Out Time is.
It's catchy.
It's a catchy song. It's got. It's certainly not a complicated song. And yeah, I'm surprised they decided to release this, since what it's about is pretty obvious. And the yippee part, it's pretty funny. It is funny. Anyway,
I always thought this was a fun song.
And then Carpet Crawlers, which is a better choice for a single, I think. It's because to me this is
still not obvious.
Well, no, because we're not going to talk about. Obviously, we're talking about it in part 2.
Right.
But this should have been a single. Whether it should have been the first or second single, but it should have been a single.
Well, I think it's a song that is pretty well revered among Genesis fans.
It's really
people
good.
Like it.
It's a really catchy melody, and I like the vocals on it are excellent when he's singing somewhat lower. Peter Gabriel has such an expressive voice, and it's he doesn't always sing in the lower register.
No.
Of it, you know, and it's he could have more.
Yeah, I always enjoy that with singers that are famous for like their high end.
Yeah.
Like Chris Cornell when he would sing low. I thought that was like the best.
Or Tiny Tim.
Or Tiny Tim. So the final song is Chamber of 32 Doors, which feels like leading into like an intermission. You know, something about this song that has a little bit of that kind of, you know, cinematic quality again, or theatrical quality.
It is cinematic though.
It is.
It really is.
And I feel like it kind of does a little bit of like a summing up for the first, you know, two sides, and it's like, and it leaves you, it's like a cliffhanger.
Yeah.
It's like he's you know, is choosing which way to go, and then, you know, flip the album.
And if
change the album.
If the, you know, part one weren't weird enough, you
just
wait.
hang on.
So that's part one, and I mean there are no weak songs on this. It's not difficult to get into. It's not, to me, it is not. There are some really great Genesis songs. I mean, real gems on the first two sides of this album. You know, we just talked about them. So you know, back in New York City, In the Cage. You know, those are fantastic. I love Carpet Crawlers is a great melody. You know, every song
they have their classics.
something to offer. So we are going to talk obviously more about this in part two, and then we'll sort of, I guess, sum it up more.
Yeah, in part two we'll kind of do a little bit more of a conclusione.
Sure.
So make sure you stay tuned for part two of The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, and please make sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, let us know what you think about this album, and please stay tuned for more videos here at Taste of Kingdoms Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Thank you so much for watching.